Dr. Eric Johnson rushed through the bustling emergency room, his white coat billowing behind him as he moved from patient to patient. It was a particularly busy night at the hospital, with several critical cases demanding his immediate attention. Despite the chaos, Eric felt a sense of control and purpose. He was in his element, doing what he did best, saving lives. As he finished stabilizing a patient with severe chest pains, a nurse called out to him. "Dr. Johnson, we have a car accident victim coming in. ETA 2 minutes." Eric nodded, quickly washing his hands and preparing for the new arrival. He felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind that came with knowing he was at the peak of his career. Years of experience had honed his skills, and he prided himself on his ability to handle even the most challenging cases with ease. The ambulance doors burst open, and paramedics wheeled in a woman on a stretcher. Eric approached, his eyes scanning the patient for visible injuries. The woman, later identified as Samantha Lewis, had cuts and bruises on her face and arms. She was conscious but clearly in pain. Eric began his assessment, asking Samantha a series of quick questions about her condition. However, something in his demeanor changed subtly. He seemed less focused, less thorough than usual. Without conducting a full examination, he made a snap judgment. "She's just a bit banged up," Eric announced to the attending nurse. "Clean and dress her wounds, give her some pain medication, and prepare her for discharge." The nurse looked uncertain. "But Dr. Johnson, shouldn't we run some tests? The paramedics mentioned potential internal injuries." Eric waved off the concern. "I've seen hundreds of cases like this. She's fine. We have more serious cases to attend to." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Samantha in the care of the bewildered nurse. As Eric moved on to his next patient, he failed to notice the commotion building near the emergency room entrance. A man in an expensive suit burst through the doors, his face a mask of worry and urgency. This was William Carter, the CEO of the hospital, though Eric remained oblivious to his presence. William spotted a nurse and grabbed her arm. "My wife," he said, breathless. "Samantha Lewis. She was in a car accident. Where is she?" The nurse pointed towards the curtained area where Samantha lay. William rushed over, pulling back the curtain to find his wife grimacing in pain, her wounds barely tended to. "What's going on here?" William demanded, his voice rising. "Why isn't she being properly treated?" The nurse explained Dr. Johnson's assessment and instructions. William's face darkened with anger and disbelief. He stormed out of the curtained area, searching for Eric. Eric was checking another patient's chart when William approached him. "Dr. Johnson," William said, his voice tightly controlled. "I need to speak with you about my wife's treatment." Eric turned, confusion evident on his face. He didn't recognize William, and his arrogance prevented him from realizing the gravity of the situation. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm quite busy. If you have concerns about a patient's treatment, please speak to the nurse at the front desk." William's composure cracked. "I'm not just any concerned family member, Dr. Johnson. I'm William Carter, the CEO of this hospital, and the woman you've neglected to properly examine is my wife." The color drained from Eric's face as the implications of his actions began to dawn on him. He stammered, trying to formulate a response, but William cut him off. "I want a full examination done on my wife immediately by another doctor, and you, Dr. Johnson, will report to my office first thing in the morning. We need to have a serious discussion about your professional conduct." As William strode away, Eric stood rooted to the spot, the bustling emergency room fading into the background. In a single moment, his feelings of superiority and control had evaporated, replaced by a creeping sense of dread. He knew he had made a grave error, one that could have serious consequences for both Samantha Lewis and his own career. The day that had started with such promise now loomed as a turning point in Eric's life, though he had yet to fully grasp the extent of the changes that lay ahead. The following morning, Dr. Eric Johnson arrived at the hospital with a sense of unease. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on his mind, but he still hadn't fully grasped the severity of his actions. As he walked through the hospital corridors, He noticed the sideways glances and hushed whispers of his colleagues. Something had changed, and he was at the center of it. William Carter, the CEO, was waiting in his office when Eric arrived. The normally composed executive could barely contain his anger. "Dr. Johnson," he began, his voice tight with controlled fury, "I want you to explain to me exactly what happened last night with my wife's treatment." Eric, still on the defensive, attempted to justify his actions. "Mr. Carter, I made a professional judgment based on my years of experience. Your wife's injuries appeared minor, and we had other critical cases to attend to." William's face reddened. "A professional judgment? Without a proper examination? My wife could have died due to your negligence." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Dr. Johnson, your actions last night were not just unprofessional, they were potentially life-threatening. And I can't help but wonder if your treatment of my wife was influenced by factors other than her medical condition." Eric's defensiveness faltered as the implication of William's words sank in. "Mr. Carter, I assure you I treat all my patients with the same level of care, regardless of their race or background." "Do you?" William challenged. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you made a snap judgment based on appearance rather than medical necessity. And that, Dr. Johnson, is unacceptable in this hospital or any healthcare facility." Before Eric could respond, there was a knock at the door. The head of the hospital board entered, her face grave. "Dr. Johnson, the board has called an emergency meeting. We need to discuss last night's incident immediately." Eric felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as he followed her to the boardroom. The meeting was tense from the start. Each board member took turns expressing their concerns about Eric's actions, their words a mix of disappointment and outrage. "Dr. Johnson, your behavior last night goes against everything this hospital stands for," one board member stated firmly. "We pride ourselves on providing equal high-quality care to all patients. Your actions have not only put a patient's life at risk, but have also opened us up to potential legal action and damaged our reputation in the community." Another board member added, "We've received reports that this isn't an isolated incident. There have been concerns raised about your treatment of minority patients in the past, though none as blatant as this." Eric tried to defend himself, but his words sounded hollow even to his own ears. He realized too late that his long-held biases had finally caught up with him, manifesting in a way he could no longer ignore or explain away. After what felt like hours of discussion and deliberation, the board reached a decision. The head of the board looked at Eric with a mix of disappointment and resolve. "Dr. Johnson, given the severity of your actions and the potential consequences for this hospital, we have no choice but to terminate your employment, effective immediately." The words hit Eric like a physical blow. He sat there, stunned, as the reality of the situation crashed down around him. His career, the thing he had prided himself on for so many years, was over in an instant. As he left the boardroom, Eric felt as though he was in a daze. He walked through the hospital corridors, aware of the stares and whispers following him. Colleagues who had once sought his advice now avoided eye contact. The respect and admiration he had cultivated over years of service had evaporated overnight. Eric cleared out his office in a fog of disbelief and shame. As he carried his box of personal items out of the hospital, the gravity of his actions began to sink in. His reputation was in ruins, his career destroyed, and worse, he had put a patient's life at risk due to his own biases and arrogance. As he stepped out into the bright sunlight, Eric realized that this was more than just a professional setback. It was a moment of reckoning, forcing him to confront the prejudices he had harbored and acted upon, perhaps unconsciously, for years. The journey ahead would be difficult, but it was clear that if Eric wanted to salvage any part of his life or career, he would need to undertake a profound change, starting with a long, hard look at himself and his beliefs. In the days following his dismissal, Dr. Eric Johnson felt the full weight of his actions as he experienced a sudden and profound isolation. The medical community, once his second home, had turned its back on him. Colleagues who had previously sought his advice now avoided him like the plague, their silence more damning than any words could be. One afternoon, Eric decided to visit a local coffee shop frequented by hospital staff. hoping to maintain some connection to his former life. As he entered, the usual buzz of conversation abruptly died down. He noticed Dr. Sarah Chen, a surgeon he had mentored early in her career, quickly averting her gaze and whispering to her companion. When Eric approached their table, Sarah stood up abruptly. "I'm sorry, Eric," she said, not meeting his eyes. "We were just leaving." Without another word, she and her colleague hurried out of the cafe, leaving Eric standing alone, acutely aware of the stares from other patrons. The incident at the coffee shop was just the beginning. Eric's phone, once constantly buzzing with calls and messages from colleagues seeking his expertise, fell silent. Invitations to medical conferences and speaking engagements were rescinded. The medical journal that had been considering his latest research paper sent a terse email withdrawing their interest in publication. At home, the situation was equally tense. Laura, Eric's wife of 20 years, struggled to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the actions that had led to his dismissal. One evening, as they sat in uncomfortable silence at the dinner table, Laura finally broached the subject. "Eric," she began hesitantly, "I've always believed in you, in your dedication to your patients. But what happened with Samantha Lewis? It's made me question everything. How could you have been so careless, so prejudiced?" Eric bristled at her words. "You don't understand the pressures of working in the ER. Sometimes you have to make quick decisions." "But this wasn't just a quick decision, was it?" Laura pressed. "William Carter seems to think there's a pattern. Have you really been treating patients differently based on their race?" The question hung in the air between them. Eric wanted to deny it outright, but the events of the past few days had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. He remained silent, unable to meet Laura's disappointed gaze. As the days passed, Eric found himself spending more and more time alone in his study, poring over medical journals and case studies, as if immersing himself in work could somehow erase what had happened. But the isolation only served to amplify his inner turmoil. One day, a tentative knock on his study door broke through his self-imposed solitude. It was Jake, a young resident who had often sought Eric's guidance at the hospital. Jake's presence was unexpected, a reminder of the mentor role Eric had once held. "Dr. Johnson," Jake said, his voice a mix of respect and uncertainty. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by. I've been thinking a lot about what happened." Eric gestured for Jake to enter, curious about the young man's intentions. Jake continued, "Your situation has made me reflect on my own attitudes and behaviors. I realized that I might have biases I'm not even aware of. I guess I'm here because, well, I want to understand. How do we recognize these biases in ourselves before they lead to mistakes like what happened with Mrs. Lewis?" Eric was taken aback by Jake's candor. For the first time since his dismissal, he felt a glimmer of purpose. Here was someone willing to learn from his mistakes, someone who saw the situation as a call for self-reflection rather than just a scandal to be whispered about. "Jake," Eric began, his voice hoarse from disuse, "I wish I had asked myself that question years ago. The truth is, I'm only now beginning to understand the depth of my own biases. It's not an easy process, and it's one I should have started long before now." As they talked, Eric felt a shift within himself. The isolation that had been suffocating him began to feel less like a punishment and more like an opportunity, a chance to confront his prejudices head-on and perhaps help others do the same. When Jake left, Eric sat in his study, lost in thought. The visit had stirred something in him, a realization that while he couldn't change the past, he could use his experience to spark important conversations about bias in healthcare. For the first time since his dismissal, Eric felt a sense of purpose. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with self-reflection and uncomfortable truths. But as he looked out the window at the setting sun, Eric knew that this journey of self-discovery and redemption was one he needed to take, not just for himself, but for all the patients who deserved better than the care he had provided. Weeks after his dismissal, Eric Johnson found himself staring at a computer screen, his cursor hovering over the register button for a diversity and inclusion program. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just months ago, he would have scoffed at the idea of needing such training. Now it felt like his only lifeline back to the medical world he once dominated. With a mix of trepidation and resignation, Eric clicked the button. The confirmation email arrived moments later, informing him that the program would start the following week. As he read through the course outline, a part of him still wanted to believe this was all unnecessary, that his years of experience should speak for themselves. But the memory of Samantha Lewis and the consequences of his actions silenced these thoughts. The first day of the program arrived, and Eric entered the community center where it was being held. He felt out of place among the diverse group of attendees, many of whom were much younger than him. As he took his seat, he noticed a few people whispering and glancing in his direction. His reputation, it seemed, had preceded him. The workshop facilitator, a woman named Dr. Amina Patel, began the session. "Welcome, everyone. We're here to explore our biases, challenge our preconceptions, and learn how to create a more inclusive environment in our respective fields." As Dr. Patel spoke, Eric found himself growing increasingly uncomfortable. The exercises and discussions forced him to confront aspects of his behavior and thinking that he had long ignored or justified. During a group activity about microaggressions, Eric realized with a start that he had committed many of the examples being discussed, often without even realizing it. One particularly impactful moment came when a young doctor shared her experience of being constantly mistaken for a nurse. Despite wearing her white coat and introducing herself as Dr. Chen, Eric remembered similar incidents in his own hospital, where he had made the same assumption about female doctors of color. The realization made him sink lower in his chair, a mixture of shame and enlightenment washing over him. As the days progressed, Eric began to engage more in the discussions. During a session on the impact of racial bias in medical treatment, he found himself sharing the story of Samantha Lewis. His voice shook as he recounted his actions and their consequences. "I've spent my entire career believing I was providing equal care to all my patients," Eric admitted to the group. "But looking back now, I can see countless instances where my biases affected my decisions. It took a catastrophic mistake for me to realize the harm I was causing." The room fell silent after Eric's confession. Then, slowly, others began to share their own experiences, both as healthcare providers who had witnessed or perpetrated bias, and as patients who had been on the receiving end of discriminatory treatment. Eric listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time in his career. As the program neared its end, Eric found himself filling notebooks with reflections and insights. He was learning not just about diversity and inclusion, but about himself. The journey was far from over, but he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since his dismissal. On the final day of the program, Dr. Patel asked each participant to share their key takeaway and commitment moving forward. When it was Eric's turn, he stood up, facing his peers. "I came here thinking this was a step I had to take to salvage my career," Eric began. "But I've realized it's about so much more than that. It's about acknowledging the harm I've caused, intentionally or not, and committing to do better. Not just for my career, but for every patient who puts their trust in healthcare providers like us." He paused, looking around the room. "My commitment is to continue this journey of self-reflection and education, to use my experience as a cautionary tale for other medical professionals, and most importantly, to advocate for systemic changes in healthcare to address the biases that I was blind to for so long." As Eric finished speaking, he noticed a few nods of approval from his fellow participants. It wasn't forgiveness or absolution, but it was a start. He knew the road to redemption would be long and challenging, but for the first time since that fateful night in the ER, Eric felt hope. Leaving the community center on the last day, certificate in hand, Eric knew that this wasn't the end of his journey, but rather the beginning of a new chapter. He had taken the first steps towards redemption, not just in his career, but in his understanding of himself and his impact on others. The real test would come in applying these lessons in the real world, in rebuilding trust, and in using his experience to effect change in a system that had allowed his biases to go unchecked for so long. As Eric Johnson returned home from the Diversity and Inclusion program, he found himself grappling with a profound internal conflict. The man he thought he was, a skilled, impartial doctor, seemed at odds with the reality of his actions and biases. This dissonance created a storm of emotions: shame, anger, confusion, and a desperate desire to change. Laura, his wife, noticed the shift in Eric's demeanor as soon as he walked through the door. She approached him cautiously, unsure of what to expect. "How was the program?" she asked, her voice tentative. Eric met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and determination. "It was eye-opening," he replied. "Laura, I think we need to talk." They sat down at the kitchen table, the same place where they had shared countless meals and conversations over the years. But this conversation was different. Eric began to open up about his experiences in the program, the realizations he had made, and the deep-seated biases he was now confronting. "I've always prided myself on being a good doctor, on treating everyone equally," Eric said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I was wrong. I've been carrying these prejudices, these biases, without even realizing it. And they've affected my patients, my colleagues, maybe even our relationship." Laura listened intently, her expression a mix of concern and relief. "I'm glad you're realizing this, Eric," she said softly. "But where do we go from here? How do you move forward?" Eric ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration and uncertainty. "I don't know exactly, but I know I can't go back to who I was before. I need to change, not just for my career, but for myself, for us, for everyone I interact with." As they continued to talk, Eric and Laura began to unpack years of unexamined beliefs and behaviors. It was a difficult conversation, filled with uncomfortable truths and painful admissions, but it was also cathartic, marking the beginning of a new understanding between them. In the days that followed, Eric found himself constantly questioning his thoughts and reactions. Every interaction, every decision became an opportunity for self-reflection. It was exhausting, but he knew it was necessary. One afternoon, as Eric was reviewing some medical journals in an attempt to stay current, he heard a knock at the door. To his surprise, it was Jake, the young resident who had visited him earlier. "Dr. Johnson," Jake said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I wanted to talk to you about something." Eric invited Jake in, curious about what had brought the young doctor to his door again. As they sat in the living room, Jake began to speak. "After our last conversation, I started paying more attention to the dynamics in the hospital," Jake explained. "And I realized I've been guilty of some of the same biases you talked about. There was this patient, an elderly black woman, and I caught myself making assumptions about her education level and ability to understand her treatment options. I stopped myself, but it made me realize how ingrained these biases can be." Eric listened intently, recognizing his own journey in Jake's words. "It's not easy to confront these things about ourselves," Eric said, "but recognizing it is the first step. What did you do next?" Jake straightened up, a look of determination on his face. "I went back and had a thorough conversation with her, explaining everything clearly without any assumptions. And you know what? She turned out to be a retired biology professor. It was a wake-up call for me." As they continued to talk, Eric felt a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, he was proud of Jake for his self-awareness and willingness to change. On the other, he felt a pang of regret for the years he had spent reinforcing these biases in his role as a mentor. "Jake," Eric said, leaning forward, "I want you to know that I'm sorry. As your mentor, I should have been teaching you these lessons long ago. Instead, I was probably reinforcing some of these biases, even if unintentionally." Jake nodded, understanding the weight of Eric's words. "That's why I came here, Dr. Johnson. I think there's an opportunity here. Your experience, what you're learning now, it could make a real difference in how we train doctors." Eric sat back, considering Jake's words. The idea of using his experience as a teaching tool, of turning his mistake into an opportunity for positive change, sparked something in him. It was a way forward, a path to redemption that didn't ignore his past, but built upon it. As Jake left, Eric felt a renewed sense of purpose. The internal conflict was still there, the shame of his past actions, the struggle to overcome ingrained biases, but now it was accompanied by a glimmer of hope. He realized that true change wouldn't come from simply attending a program or having a few conversations. It would require constant vigilance, ongoing education, and a willingness to be uncomfortable. Eric knew the road ahead would be challenging. He would face skepticism, resistance, and his own doubts. But for the first time since that fateful night in the ER, he felt he had a clear direction. His journey wasn't just about personal redemption anymore. It was about creating lasting change in a system that had allowed biases to flourish unchecked for too long. Months after his dismissal and subsequent journey of self-reflection, Eric Johnson received an unexpected email. It was an invitation to speak at a medical conference about bias in healthcare. The organizers, aware of his story, wanted him to share his experience and the lessons he had learned. Eric stared at the screen, a mix of anxiety and determination washing over him. After discussing it with Laura, who offered her full support, Eric decided to accept the invitation. As the day of the conference approached, he spent countless hours preparing his speech, poring over his notes from the diversity program, and reflecting on his journey. On the day of the conference, Eric arrived early, his heart pounding as he entered the venue. He recognized many faces in the crowd, former colleagues, medical students he had taught, and even some patients he had treated over the years. The weight of their gazes, some curious, others skeptical, some even hostile, felt almost unbearable. As Eric took the stage, he gripped the podium, taking a deep breath to steady himself. "Good morning," he began, his voice slightly shaky. "My name is Dr. Eric Johnson, and I'm here to talk about a critical issue in healthcare, one that I was blind to for far too long." He launched into his story, recounting the night he failed to properly treat Samantha Lewis and the cascade of events that followed. Eric didn't shy away from the uncomfortable truths, laying bare his biases and the harm they had caused. "I stood before patients for years believing I was providing equal care to all," Eric said, his voice growing stronger. "But I was wrong. My biases, many of which I wasn't even aware of, influenced my decisions and compromised the quality of care I provided to certain patients." As he spoke, Eric could see the audience's reaction changing. The initial skepticism began to give way to engaged listening. He shared specific examples of how unconscious bias can manifest in medical settings, drawing not only from his own experience, but also from the stories he had heard during the diversity program and from conversations with Jake. "It's not enough to simply not be racist," Eric continued. "We must be actively anti-racist. We must question our assumptions, challenge our ingrained beliefs, and constantly strive to provide truly equitable care." Eric then outlined the steps he had taken to educate himself and the ongoing process of recognizing and confronting his biases. He emphasized the importance of systemic changes in medical education and hospital policies to address these issues. As he concluded his speech, Eric looked out at the audience. "I stand before you today not as an expert, but as a cautionary tale. My journey is far from over, but I am committed to using my experience to drive change. I invite all of you to join me in this crucial work of self-reflection and systemic improvement." To Eric's surprise, the audience responded with applause. It wasn't thunderous, but it was genuine. As he stepped down from the stage, several attendees approached him, eager to continue the conversation. Dr. Sarah Chen, the colleague who had avoided him in the coffee shop months ago, was among them. "Eric," she said, her voice soft but firm, "thank you for your honesty. Your speech has made me reflect on my own practices. I think we all have work to do." Throughout the rest of the conference, Eric found himself engaged in deep, sometimes uncomfortable conversations about bias in healthcare. Medical students sought his advice on how to recognize and combat their own biases. Senior doctors, initially defensive, began to open up about their own experiences and challenges. As the conference came to a close, Dr. Amina Patel, the facilitator from the diversity program, approached Eric. "Dr. Johnson," she said with a smile, "I'm impressed by how far you've come. Your story and your willingness to share it openly can make a real difference." Eric felt a warmth in his chest at her words, but he was quick to temper it. "Thank you, Dr. Patel. But I know this is just the beginning. There's still so much work to be done." Dr. Patel nodded in agreement. "Absolutely, which is why I'd like to invite you to collaborate on developing a bias awareness program for medical schools. Your perspective could be invaluable." As Eric left the conference center, he felt a complex mix of emotions. There was a sense of accomplishment, yes, but also a deep understanding of the responsibility he now carried. The recognition he had received wasn't an endpoint, but a beginning, a call to continue the difficult work of changing not just himself, but the medical community as a whole. On the drive home, Eric reflected on the day's events. The applause, the conversations, Dr. Patel's invitation, they were all steps toward redemption. But he knew that true redemption wouldn't come from recognition or accolades. It would come from the ongoing work of confronting bias, from the patients who would receive better care, from the students and colleagues he could influence to examine their own biases. Eric realized that his journey had evolved. What started as a personal quest for redemption had become a mission to effect broader change. As he pulled into his driveway, he felt both exhausted and invigorated, ready to tackle the challenges that lay ahead. In the weeks following the conference, Eric Johnson found himself on a new path, one that would test his commitment to change and his ability to make a meaningful impact. The first step on this path led him to a small community clinic in an underserved neighborhood. Eric had decided to volunteer his services at the clinic, seeing it as an opportunity to put his newfound awareness into practice. On his first day, he arrived early, nervous energy coursing through him. The clinic was a far cry from the state-of-the-art hospital he was used to, with its outdated equipment and overcrowded waiting room. As Eric began seeing patients, he forced himself to slow down, to listen more carefully, and to constantly question his assumptions. Each interaction became a chance to practice the skills he had learned and to challenge his ingrained biases. One patient, an elderly Hispanic woman named Maria, came in complaining of chronic pain. In the past, Eric might have quickly prescribed pain medication and moved on. Instead, he took the time to delve deeper into her living situation, her diet, and her daily activities. Through this conversation, he discovered that Maria's pain was exacerbated by her job as a housekeeper and her inability to afford proper shoes. Eric worked with the clinic's social worker to find resources for Maria, including a job training program and access to discounted orthopedic shoes. As he explained the plan to Maria, her grateful smile reminded Eric of why he had become a doctor in the first place. Meanwhile, Laura had found her own way to contribute to the cause. Inspired by Eric's journey, she had begun volunteering with a patient advocacy group, working to ensure that patients from all backgrounds received equitable treatment in healthcare settings. One evening, as they shared dinner, Laura excitedly told Eric about a project she was working on. "We're developing a patient education program," she explained. "It's designed to empower patients to speak up about their care and recognize potential bias or discrimination." Eric listened intently, realizing how much his actions had influenced not just his own life, but Laura's as well. Their shared commitment to addressing healthcare inequities had brought them closer, giving their relationship a new depth and purpose. At the hospital, Jake had taken Eric's lessons to heart. He had initiated a series of discussions among the residents about recognizing and addressing bias in patient care. These conversations weren't always easy, but they were necessary, and slowly Jake saw attitudes beginning to shift. One day, Jake called Eric to share some news. "Dr. Johnson, you won't believe this," he said, his voice filled with excitement. The hospital administration has agreed to implement a mandatory bias training program for all staff. They want you to help develop it. Eric felt a surge of emotion at Jake's words. The idea that his experience could lead to institutional change was both thrilling and humbling. "That's incredible, Jake," he replied. "But remember, this isn't about me. It's about creating a healthcare system that truly serves all patients equally." As the weeks turned into months, Eric found himself juggling multiple roles. He continued his volunteer work at the clinic, served as a consultant for the hospital's new training program, and worked with Dr. Patel on developing curriculum for medical schools. The work was challenging and often emotionally draining. Eric faced skepticism from some colleagues who saw his efforts as unnecessary or exaggerated. There were times when he questioned whether he was making any real difference. But then there were moments that reminded him of the importance of his journey, like when a young doctor at the clinic thanked him for teaching her to recognize her own biases, or when a patient from a minority community expressed gratitude for feeling truly heard and understood during their appointment. 1 year after the incident with Samantha Lewis, Eric received an unexpected letter. It was from William Carter, the hospital CEO. William wrote about the changes that had been implemented at the hospital since Eric's departure, acknowledging that the incident had been a wake-up call for the entire institution. The letter concluded with an invitation. "Dr. Johnson, while the circumstances of your departure were regrettable, your subsequent actions have demonstrated a genuine commitment to change. We would like to invite you to speak at our annual staff meeting about your journey and the importance of addressing bias in healthcare." As Eric read the letter, he felt a complex mix of emotions. There was a sense of validation, yes, but also a renewed understanding of the responsibility he carried. His redemption wasn't a destination he had reached, but an ongoing process, a daily commitment to do better and to help others do the same. Eric realized that his path to redemption wasn't just about personal growth or even about his individual interactions with patients. It was about contributing to a larger shift in the medical community, about using his experience to drive systemic change. As he sat down to reply to William's letter, Eric felt a sense of purpose stronger than any he had experienced in his medical career. He knew that the road ahead would continue to be challenging, but he was ready to face those challenges. For Eric, this wasn't just about redeeming himself anymore. It was about helping to create a more equitable and compassionate healthcare system for all. The day of Eric Johnson's return to the hospital arrived with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. As he walked through the familiar corridors, he felt the weight of every glance, every whispered conversation that halted as he passed. This was no longer his domain, but a place where he now stood as both a cautionary tale and a potential agent of change. Eric made his way to the conference room where the hospital board was gathered. William Carter, the CEO, greeted him with a firm handshake. "Dr. Johnson, thank you for coming. We have a lot to discuss." As Eric took his seat, he noticed the diversity of the board had increased since his departure. William began the meeting by addressing the elephant in the room. "Over the past year, our hospital has faced significant criticism for our lack of diversity and inclusion. Dr. Johnson's incident was a wake-up call, but it also highlighted systemic issues we can no longer ignore." The board members nodded solemnly. William continued, "We've invited Dr. Johnson here today not just to share his experiences, but to help us reshape our policies and culture." Eric took a deep breath and began to speak. He shared his journey of self-discovery, the biases he had confronted within himself, and the work he had been doing at the community clinic. He didn't shy away from the uncomfortable truths, acknowledging the harm his actions had caused. "I stand before you not as an expert, but as someone who has seen firsthand the damage that unchecked biases can cause," Eric said. "I believe my experience, painful as it was, can serve as a powerful tool for change." As Eric spoke, he could see the board members' reactions shifting. Some who had initially seemed skeptical began to lean in, engaged by his candor and the concrete suggestions he offered for improving the hospital's approach to diversity and inclusion. One board member, Dr. Yara Nasser, spoke up. Dr. Johnson, your insights are valuable, but how do we ensure that these changes are more than just superficial? How do we create lasting change in the culture of our hospital? Eric nodded, appreciating the challenging question. It starts with acknowledging that this isn't a one-time fix. It requires ongoing education, constant self-reflection, and a willingness to be uncomfortable. We need to create spaces for open dialogue about bias, establish mentorship programs that prioritize diversity, and implement accountability measures in our patient care protocols. The discussion continued for hours, with board members asking tough questions, and Eric, along with William, proposing concrete steps for change. By the end of the meeting, a framework for a comprehensive diversity and inclusion program had begun to take shape. As the meeting concluded, William turned to Eric. Dr. Johnson, we would like to offer you a position as our diversity and inclusion consultant. Your role would be to help implement these changes and continue to educate our staff on recognizing and addressing bias in patient care. Eric was taken aback by the offer. He glanced around the room, seeing nods of approval from the board members. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him, returning to the very institution that had dismissed him, now in a role created because of his mistake. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Carter, Eric said carefully, but I need to be sure that this isn't just about image rehabilitation for the hospital. Real change requires a genuine commitment from everyone, from the board to the newest intern. William nodded solemnly. We understand, Dr. Johnson. This isn't about quick fixes or PR moves. We're committed to doing the hard work necessary to create lasting change. Eric considered the offer. He thought about the patients at the community clinic, about Jake and the other young doctors eager to learn, about Samantha Lewis and all the patients who had received subpar care due to unchecked biases. I accept, Eric said finally, but on one condition. I want to continue my work at the community clinic. I believe keeping one foot in that world will help me stay grounded and in touch with the realities of underserved communities. William agreed, and as the meeting adjourned, Eric felt a mix of emotions. There was a sense of coming full circle, of the opportunity to right past wrongs, but he also felt the weight of the responsibility he was taking on. As he left the hospital that day, Eric realized that his journey of redemption had entered a new phase. He wasn't just working on himself anymore. He was now in a position to effect change on a larger scale. The path ahead would be challenging, requiring him to confront not just his own biases, but also to help others recognize and address theirs. Eric knew that some staff members would resist. That change would be slow and often frustrating. But as he thought about the potential impact, the lives that could be improved or even saved by more equitable, unbiased care, he felt ready to face those challenges. His return to the hospital wasn't an ending, but a new beginning. It was a chance to transform a place that had once been a symbol of his failure into a beacon of progress and change. As Eric drove home to share the news with Laura, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The real work, he knew, was just beginning. Eric Johnson's return to the hospital as the new diversity and inclusion consultant was met with mixed reactions. Some staff members welcomed the change, eager to learn and improve their practice. Others were skeptical, viewing Eric's appointment as a PR stunt or an unnecessary disruption to their routines. Eric's first few weeks were challenging. He faced resistance from veteran doctors who felt they didn't need sensitivity training and encountered wariness from minority staff members who questioned his sincerity. Eric knew that gaining their trust would be a gradual process, requiring consistency, transparency, and genuine effort. He began by organizing small group sessions, creating safe spaces for staff to discuss their experiences and concerns. In one such session, a nurse named Miguel shared his frustration at constantly being mistaken for janitorial staff, despite wearing scrubs and a name tag. Eric listened intently, using the moment to highlight how unconscious biases manifest in daily interactions. These aren't just isolated incidents, Eric explained to the group. They're symptoms of systemic issues that we all need to address, myself included. Eric's willingness to acknowledge his own ongoing learning process slowly began to win over some of the skeptics. He made a point of being visible throughout the hospital, engaging in conversations with staff at all levels, from surgeons to cafeteria workers. One day, Eric overheard two residents discussing a patient's case. "I'm not sure she's compliant with her medication," one said. "You know how these people are." Eric intervened, gently but firmly. "Let's take a step back," he said. "What do we actually know about this patient's situation? Have we considered language barriers, work schedules, or financial constraints that might affect her ability to follow the prescribed regimen?" The residents were initially defensive, but soon engaged in a productive discussion about assumptions and patient care. Word of these interactions spread, and gradually more staff members began to seek out Eric's input on challenging situations. Meanwhile, Eric continued his work at the community clinic, which helped him stay connected to the realities of underserved patients. He used these experiences to inform his work at the hospital, advocating for changes in policies and procedures to better serve diverse populations. As weeks turned into months, Eric noticed subtle shifts in the hospital's atmosphere. Staff members became more mindful of their language and more willing to question their assumptions. The hospital's patient satisfaction scores began to improve, particularly among minority patients. However, Eric knew that the real test of trust would come from the patients themselves. He was acutely aware that his position didn't erase the harm caused by his past actions or the systemic issues within healthcare. One afternoon, Eric was surprised to see a familiar face in the hospital lobby, Samantha Lewis, the patient whose mistreatment had led to his dismissal. She was there for a follow-up appointment and seemed startled to see Eric. "Dr. Johnson," she said, her voice guarded, "I heard you were back." Eric felt a rush of shame and regret. "Mrs. Lewis, I owe you an apology. My treatment of you was inexcusable, and I'm deeply sorry for the harm I caused." Samantha studied him for a moment. "I appreciate your apology, Dr. Johnson, but I hope you understand that words alone aren't enough." Eric nodded. "You're absolutely right. That's why I'm here now, working to change the systems that allowed my biases to go unchecked. But I know that doesn't undo what happened to you." To Eric's surprise, Samantha's expression softened slightly. "I've heard about the changes happening here," she said. "My friend works as a nurse on the 3rd floor. She says things are different now." "We're trying," Eric replied, "but we still have a long way to go. Your experience, it was a wake-up call for this institution, and for me personally. We're committed to doing better." Samantha nodded thoughtfully. "Well, Dr. Johnson, I can't say I've forgiven you entirely, but I do believe in second chances when they're earned. Keep doing the work." As Samantha walked away, Eric felt a complex mix of emotions. Her words were a reminder of the harm he had caused, but also an affirmation that his efforts were making a tangible difference. Later that week, Eric received an email from William Carter. The hospital's board had reviewed the progress of the diversity and inclusion initiatives. Patient satisfaction scores were up, staff retention had improved, and there was a noticeable decrease in complaints related to discriminatory treatment. "Your work is making a real difference, Dr. Johnson," William wrote. "We're seeing a cultural shift that goes beyond just following new policies. People are thinking and acting differently." Eric read the email with a sense of cautious optimism. He knew that gaining trust, from colleagues, from patients, from the community, was an ongoing process. There would be setbacks and challenges ahead. But he also saw signs of genuine progress, of minds opening and practices changing. As he prepared for another day of rounds, workshops, and conversations, Eric reflected on his journey. The path to redemption and rebuilding trust was long and often difficult. But with each small victory, each mind changed, and each patient better served, he felt he was moving in the right direction. The work was far from over, but Eric was committed to seeing it through one day, one interaction, one changed mind at a time. As Eric Johnson settled into his role as diversity and inclusion consultant, he began to feel that real change was taking root in the hospital. However, a new challenge was about to test the institution's commitment to equity and force Eric to confront the limits of his influence. One morning, William Carter called Eric into his office. The CEO's face was grave as he closed the door behind them. "Eric, we have a situation," William began, his voice low. "I've uncovered evidence that Dr. Richard Hartley, one of our board members, has been involved in some questionable practices." Eric listened intently as William explained. Dr. Hartley, a long-standing member of the hospital board, had apparently been manipulating patient assignments, ensuring that wealthy white patients were given priority treatment while redirecting minority patients to overworked junior staff or even to other hospitals. "This goes beyond individual bias, Eric," William said, running a hand through his hair. "This is systemic discrimination, and it's been happening right under our noses." Eric felt a surge of anger and disappointment. The revelations threatened to undermine all the progress they had made. "What do you need from me, William?" he asked, his voice tight with determination. William leaned forward. "I need your help to gather more evidence and build a case. This won't be easy. Hartley has a lot of influence, both here and in the medical community at large. We need to be certain before we make any accusations." Over the next few weeks, Eric worked tirelessly, reviewing patient records, interviewing staff, and piecing together a pattern of discrimination that stretched back years. He enlisted the help of Jake and other trusted colleagues, knowing that they needed irrefutable evidence to confront someone as powerful as Dr. Hartley. As they delved deeper, they uncovered more than just patient assignment issues. There were instances of research funding being redirected from studies focused on health disparities, hiring practices that consistently overlooked qualified minority candidates, and a pattern of dismissing complaints about discriminatory treatment. The scope of the problem was larger than Eric had imagined, and he realized that Dr. Hartley's actions had created a culture of bias that permeated multiple levels of the hospital's operations. With a comprehensive report in hand, Eric and William called for an emergency board meeting. The atmosphere was tense as they presented their findings. Dr. Hartley, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, sat stone-faced as the evidence mounted against him. When they finished, Dr. Hartley stood up, his face flushed with anger. "This is preposterous," he spat. "You're twisting normal administrative decisions into some sort of racist conspiracy. Johnson, you're nothing but a failed doctor trying to save his career by crying discrimination at every turn." Eric felt a flash of his old defensiveness, but he pushed it aside. "Dr. Hartley, this isn't about me," he said calmly. "The evidence speaks for itself. Your actions have caused real harm to patients and to this institution." The room erupted into heated discussion. Some board members defended Hartley, citing his years of service and donations to the hospital. Others expressed shock and dismay at the revelations. In the midst of the chaos, a voice cut through the noise. It was Dr. Yara Nasser, the board member who had challenged Eric during his initial return to the hospital. "Colleagues, please," she said firmly. "We can't ignore this evidence. If we're serious about our commitment to equality and fair treatment, we need to take action." Her words seemed to shift the energy in the room. One by one, other board members began to voice their agreement. Even some of Hartley's initial defenders began to waver as they grappled with the extent of his actions. Finally, William called for a vote. The result was clear. Dr. Hartley would be removed from the board, and a full investigation would be launched into all areas of hospital operations to root out any lingering discriminatory practices. As Dr. Hartley stormed out of the room, Eric felt a complex mix of emotions. There was a sense of victory, yes, but also a sobering realization of how deeply entrenched these issues were, even in an institution actively working towards change. In the days that followed, the hospital buzzed with the news of Dr. Hartley's dismissal. Eric found himself at the center of many conversations, explaining the situation and fielding questions about what would happen next. During a staff meeting, a young nurse raised her hand. "Dr. Johnson," she began hesitantly, "does this mean all our work on diversity and inclusion was for nothing? If someone like Dr. Hartley could be doing this all along, how can we trust that real change is possible?" Eric paused, considering his words carefully. "What happened with Dr. Hartley is a reminder that this work is never done," he said. "But the fact that we uncovered it, that we're dealing with it openly, that's a sign of progress. A year ago, this might have been swept under the rug. Today, we're facing it head-on." As he looked out at the faces of his colleagues, some nodding in agreement, others still processing the shock, Eric realized that this was a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire institution. The exposure of Dr. Hartley's actions had laid bare the depth of the challenge they faced, but it had also galvanized a renewed commitment to change. Eric knew that the road ahead would be difficult. Undoing years of systemic bias would require more than just new policies or training sessions. It would demand ongoing vigilance, difficult conversations, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But as he stood there, surrounded by colleagues who were ready to do the hard work of transformation, Eric felt a sense of hope stronger than any he had experienced since beginning this journey. They had faced a moment of crisis and emerged with a clearer vision and a stronger resolve. The final turning point, Eric realized, wasn't just about exposing one person's wrongdoing. It was about the entire institution coming together to say, unequivocally, that discrimination had no place in their hospital. As he left the meeting, Eric knew that while his personal journey of redemption might never truly be complete, he was now part of something larger, a collective movement towards a more just and equitable healthcare system.